Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I'm Aaron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Natalie Jovanic. I totally butchered that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I'm very happy to be here. Do you want me to jump in and tell more about me?
Yeah, why don't you just start off with just telling me a little bit more about yourself?
Yes. Okay. First of all, I work as a trauma counselor and an anti-oppression coach for leaders in Calgary in Canada. I'm originally German-Croatian, and I am non-binary, which means gender doesn't make a lot of sense for me. So I'm more on the transgender spectrum. So I belong to the group of gender diverse people. So I think my own journey really motivated me to integrate anti-oppressive practices into counseling, which often isn't the case, and really think about my own privilege and how I can do more for clients. So when it comes to gender diversity, I'm aware about how complex society is. So my experience of oppression, I think, taught me a lot around those areas where I have privilege and to be really mindful about privilege.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain a little more when you talk about the anti-oppressive piece or techniques or whatever practices? Can you explain what you mean when you're talking about that? Like what that would look like?
Yes, like for me, it's really about, for example, in my own business, I thought about how can I be more inclusive for people living with disabilities. And so for example, some of my clients, they live with chronic pain. And so their capacity to do counseling really depends on the day, and it can change really quickly. So in general, I have a rule around late cancellations. So people need to pay a fee when they have late cancellations. However, if somebody's living with chronic pain, I don't have this rule. So this is one tiny step on how I can create more inclusion. I also I have clients that are hard of hearing. So we work together on how do I position myself in the room so that they can hear me, and what can I do so that it's easier for them, because they usually have a story that they try really, really hard to fit into a world where everybody can hear, and it's really exhausting for them.
Okay, that makes sense. So you're kind of trying not to have things in place out your procedures or different things that just kind of automatically make it harder for somebody to participate in your services or penalize them because of just who they are.
Yes. Yes, and on a systemic level, I also look at how can I dismantle power imbalances in the counseling field. What is my role in it? How can I adjust models and acknowledge oppression when it shows up in the stories of my clients, and also acknowledge that it's not okay, because it's often so normalized that people aren't even aware that it's not a healthy dynamic.
Right. So how did you get into this field?
I got into this field because I experienced childhood abuse. And so when I did my own healing journey, I just learned a lot about what is healthy counseling and what are maybe models that didn't work at all for me. It taught me a lot around what is healthy use of power and what is misuse of power. So when I did my own healing, I overcame also my skepticism whether healing is possible, because I had a lot of stigma, or was targeted by stigma. So I had this belief that I would be forever broken. And so I noticed that isn't true. And then afterwards, I got into the counseling field.
Gotcha. So in the counseling space that you're in, is there, I don't know if you can answer this, but is there what percentage of people do you feel are turned off just by some of the oppressive or systemic things in the field? Is there a large number of people who just don't try it because of the way stuff is set up, you think?
Oh, people coming to me?
Yeah, or people, let's say I need
clients.
If I have some trauma or something and I feel I need help, but maybe is there some people who just won't even do it because of an experience, or they know there's something that they just don't want to deal with the way the system's set up?
Yes. Okay. I think, okay, I know that there are some people, first of all, that have been harmed by counselors. So it takes them a lot of courage to try again.
Yeah.
I have my own podcast about trauma, where I talk about trauma just to dismantle stigma, because I think people are often not aware how much of what they experience is based to what happened to them and what is this layer of the social dynamics that may prevent them to seek out help. Sure. And I also provide psychoeducation on like how to find a good trauma counselor, what questions to ask them to make an informed choice, because not every counselor is trained in trauma and not every counselor is trained in anti-oppressive practices. So it's really like, it's a huge field with so many different options that I think clients can get easily confused. And so I try to have a podcast to educate more about it and destigmatize it. So to give more informed choices, where I more or less talk about things I would have loved to know before I started my healing.
Awesome. No, that's great. Yeah, that's so can you maybe give like some examples of like what to look for in a counselor for if you have trauma, like what questions you could ask or what things to look for to know that somebody might be safe for you?
Sure. Like, first of all, I would ask the counselor, like, training is important, but also like, how do they apply the training? How much experience do they have really working with your specific situation? Like, for example, trauma recovery looks different if somebody had trauma due to an accident or if somebody had trauma due to childhood abuse. So recovery is very different, and the collaboration needs to be adjusted to what has happened to you. So really asking the question, how much experience do they have? Also asking them, how do they view power? How do they actively navigate power in the relationship? Because trauma usually has an aspect of misuse of power. So it's really important that we don't repeat this toxic cycle in the counseling relationship. Personally, I would also ask my counselor how much personal work have they done on their own healing, because we are all shaped by the society we live in. So we all may have internalized stigmatizing belief about what's possible and what's not. So really asking these questions can be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. What is your definition of inclusion?
Okay, like for me, inclusion is really an intentional and ongoing process of creating spaces where individuals from marginalized communities feel genuinely welcome, valued, and empowered to contribute meaningfully, so that they really feel their voice is heard. And so for me, inclusion ensures that everyone, regardless of their identity, has a voice in the decision-making process and equitable access to the opportunity. And so for me, in its core, inclusion is really a continuous journey of learning, unlearning, and adapting. And it really requires us to reflect and challenge our biases, to understand systemic barriers, and really to foster mutual respect and collaboration. And so it also means for me that we dismantle hierarchies of privilege and power to build also these environments where all voices that are usually historically silenced are heard and respected. And so this way we can really co-create a world where people from marginalized communities actively shape decision-making, and they can really drive how to create a meaningful change.
Yeah, that's great. That was a great definition. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a lot of stuff that you shared. I mean, if maybe somebody listening think like that's just so much stuff that needs to be done to bring about like true inclusion. I mean, what are some smaller things, or what are ways that we can work just ourselves to make the world more inclusive?
Like for me, I think it's really being honest about ourselves. Like, what do we know about people, of the lived experience of people who are different to us? So for example, when it comes with people with disabilities, like what voices are excluded from your circle, and how can you reach out and really learn from people that are currently excluded from your circle, and really that you reflect on your privilege and think about what is one small change that you can make to promote more inclusion. Like, just for example, I used to co-lead the accessibility committee for Pride. And so in this journey, I really learned a lot from the other committee members. So for example, one individual was living in a wheelchair. So we walked together through Calgary, and I really saw and I understood all the barriers that are there that for me, as somebody who walks, I would never see them.
Yeah.
And so this really helped me to very much reflect on it. And like there are so many areas. So I think really try to sort out what voices are part of your life, and then think about what is one step on how you can expand your knowledge in each of the areas. And honestly, I think it's a journey that brings a lot of joy.
Right.
Like, I know that some people have so much fear around it, but in the end, it is joyful if you have a more diverse view on society.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. So my partner, we've been together 3 years, and the reason I'm in the inclusion space, I have a daughter who's 22, has cerebral palsy and epilepsy, so she uses a wheelchair. My partner's told me a couple times that since, we've been together, she didn't before, she heard there was in the U.S. the Americans with Disability Act. So she kind of thought there's a law, so everything's, accessible. Well, being around me and my daughter using a wheelchair, like you're saying, we've been to numerous places where there's not curb cuts, there's not a ramp, or, it's not accessible. So now because she's been around it, experienced it herself, she understands, everything isn't accessible yet. So that is a great point. Like you said, you just take the time to walk around with a person, have them show you how they experience life, and then you can learn, about the things that they experience. So that's a great tip.
Yeah.
So for me, I think we talked before we started recording, I'm not only more recently involved with the LGBTQ community. Like for me, if I'm not kind of involved in that or don't know anybody, what would be like a good place I could go, or some place that I could, experience that more? Maybe like a Pride event, you think? Or like where would you think I should go to try to learn more and meet more people?
Yeah. Well, but like I think a Pride event can be a start. You can also start, I think, with reading like memoirs from people who are queer, and also be aware the queer community is really big. Like gender diversity is one part of it. We have sexual diversity, and we have a lot of different intersections. So I think just be curious. You can also see whether you can volunteer for one of the organizations that are focused on queer folks. And just listen to their stories and learn from their stories, and then use their stories to think about what are the things you don't know.
Right.
Like, I think US and I think in general the world right now is getting more anti-queer again. And so like it's affecting us as a community. And I think there is more fear, and there's also more fear of what if it gets worse.
Right. Yeah, I think you're correct. I mean, from what I'm heard, like after the election and stuff, I've seen a lot of stuff about transgender people are worried about with the new administration, lots of things going backwards. So I think you are correct. That is, as a fear happening now for sure in the U.S. So
yeah. Like I also maybe one thing what comes to my mind also, like use social media. Like there are some influencers that are queer on LinkedIn or probably also on Instagram. Just follow them and learn from them.
Sure. No, that's a great point. Yeah, and I mean, for me, like the inclusion, I mean, I focus mostly on inclusion for people with disabilities, but I mean, at the same time, I can't be out there, rallying around inclusion for disabilities and then not being on the bandwagon for inclusion for, LGBTQ or, different, African American or different races, things as well. So to me, it's all the same thing. We need to include everybody regardless of, whatever label or we put on them. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Like, I think it's always complicated if you just focus on one group. Like I have white privilege and I'm very aware that I have it because then the other group just gets not the equity that they would deserve.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of intersectionalities, like you're saying, like white and different things. And if you were African-American in this, with those other things, it would be different. So it all plays together, and need to recognize that. And so what are like some of the bigger challenges that you face in your work, or trying to talk about what you talk about and create awareness and help people?
I think for me, one of the challenges that kind of is fine, I find it sad. Like what I've noticed is people attend my workshops and I explain to them how they can manage their privilege healthily, and I give them clear guidelines. But then I kind of have a connection with them. Like it happened with a couple of counselors. So they attended my workshop and then we stayed in touch. But then I noticed that they didn't apply anything what I told them in my workshops. So then I said to them, hey, can we have a conversation about it? But in the conversation, there was a lot of defensiveness and there was no way for me to create a connection and really talk like, what is going on your side? Like, I'm just curious because I don't understand why people attend workshops, but then in the end, they just let it all go. And so I think for me, one of the major obstacles is really performative action. I don't find anti-oppressive practices complicated, but it requires, I think, probably about a year where you just start to change your mindset. But like once you have integrated it, it's really like I ask myself, like, what is my privilege toward the person? What do I know about them? What do I not know about them? And like, how can I learn more? But I just notice there's a lot of protective parts, I would say, that sometimes prevent people to really dig deeper into the work.
Right.
And so there is a certain degree of sadness for me because I'm like, okay, how can I make sure that I create like really workshops that provide quality for people, that they really start practicing it?
Right. So do you think people are just attending the workshops just to kind of like check a box, say I went there, and that's some people that's just enough in their mind?
I don't know everybody who attended it. Like I've noticed for me, it's often more effective to work with clients one-on-one because we can go deeper. Right. I've noticed these workshops where people just have 1.5 hours or 2 hours. Yeah. They just like follow up. So I sometimes have groups that run for a longer time because then I can also check in with people. What are they really doing? Yeah. But like these 2-hour workshops, there might be a starting point. But what I've noticed, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's really also not knowing. People like to really follow up and implement it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, you really had me thinking. That's why I'm pausing a lot. There's just like so much stuff flying around in my head. Do you think part of it too is though it's just I'm 47. I grew up, my family didn't really talk about like any issues or anything like this deep probably. So for me, it's just I have to get over the part of like just start talking about it first of all, and then thinking through it and like, looking at my life and maybe I am doing some things wrong that I need to change. So I feel like there's probably a lot of levels to, the stuff you're talking about when somebody starts hearing about it.
Like deep inside, and this is a bit like where I think my lived experience is different. Like I can't avoid discomfort. If I hang out with Canadians, I'm not Canadian. So there is a part of me that is aware of cultural differences. Right. I hang out mostly with cis folks. I'm not cis. So it's a part of me that is constantly in discomfort. And I needed to find a way, how do I navigate it? How do I navigate transphobia? But what I think is the social condition is very much avoid discomfort. And also there's a lot around wanting to be a good person and you're not a good person if you make a mistake, which isn't true. Right. But like, I think this is more like sometimes the idea of wanting to be good isn't helpful for anti-oppressive practices or inclusion, because in the end, we all have a shadow. I have a shadow and I need to sit with it and I need to expand my knowledge around it. And it's not about wanting to be good or bad. It's actually not like, it's more like, how can I grow and learn?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of levels to it, isn't there?
I think like for me, honestly, true inclusion, wanting to go there, it is a journey that requires personal growth. Like it's not something we do in our heads. It's really, we look at ourselves. What have we learned about society? What beliefs have we taken on? Are they really true?
Right. No, it is true. Yeah, you have to look inside yourself. Think. Why am I doing this? And is this the correct way to do it? Do I need to change something? So there's a lot of introspection, a lot of taking time with yourself, sitting with what you're doing and thinking about it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And also honesty. Like I once had a client and she was working on cis privilege. And at one stage she said to me, well, it's hard for me to acknowledge it, but I still think I project onto you that you're a woman. And like, I found this honesty really helpful because if she wouldn't share it, we couldn't talk about it.
True.
And so I think like sometimes we really need to go into these deep, meaningful conversations that are scary. But if we don't have them, Like, we can't
Right.
change anything. If people just
That's
say me
true.
everything is great, like I sometimes say to people, hey, I'm non-binary, and a part of me is aware that they probably don't know, but they don't say anything.
Right.
And then I'm like, okay, like I assume you know what it
Right.
means, but if they don't let me know, I don't know what to do with it.
No, that is that is very true. Because if us talking, something pops into my head, and I'm like, crap, I don't know if I should ask this because I don't want to offend you or whatever, but I don't ask it. It's still in the back of my mind. So then that kind of changes how I'm asking things or how we interact. So yeah, we definitely have to have those conversations where there is a chance that somebody could be offended, or I say something wrong or whatever. But without taking those chances to be vulnerable, we're not gonna proceed or learn more about each other.
No, I agree. Like, and I think sometimes it depends on the state the person is in. Like, you can ask consent, whether it's okay to ask the question. Like, when I was really hurt by the systemic dynamics, I wasn't in a state to explain it to people. So I usually would set a boundary. Now I've done a lot of my own work, so I'm open to have these conversations. And honestly, I see the value of it, but like I wouldn't do it if I'm in a bad place.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. So when did you move to Canada? Or how old were you when you moved to Canada?
I moved to Canada 10 years ago. So I was in my 40s. Okay. And I came from Spain. So I think first of all, I'm German Croatian. So I think a lot of the German history made me reflect on privilege and oppression and like, how do we overcome these ingrained dynamics? Because to some degree, even like Germany went it to the most extreme, but I think sitting with it really helped me to acknowledge that society has a shadow, and many of these dynamics of oppression we have now are similar. Like it's the same groups. It's just a different dynamic that is far less extreme, but it's still somehow there.
So did you live in Germany when the wall was up?
I lived in Germany when the wall was up.
Wow. So which side did you live on?
I lived in West Germany, western part of Germany.
Was that the communist side?
No, it's not the communist side. Okay, like, gotcha. I would say, like, my parents, they lived through the war, so they all flew from Eastern Germany to Western Germany. Yep. And so we didn't live in the area. There were some relatives that lived in Eastern Germany. Okay.
Wow. I'm aging myself because I remember when the wall came down, so that's interesting. So your experience from like living in Germany, Spain, and now Canada, like, can you maybe talk through like which of those? I mean, which of those settings is like more inclusive, or I mean, I'm not sure if you can rate them, but like, what's the differences you see? What's the differences you've been seeing like in the different countries and stuff?
Okay. It depends on which part of which identity of me you talk to.
Okay.
So I think Germany was easier for me when it came to my non-binary identity, just because I think language-wise, German language was just more not as gendered as, for example, Canadian language.
Okay.
Germany was sometimes complicated because my last name isn't German, so people didn't identify me as German. And so I had similar kind of things like, oh, you speak German really well for being a foreigner. So this was a bit like, which was difficult there. In general, I would say, since I am German, it's easier to live in a country where you really have citizenship. So from relationship perspective, I think the country that was easiest and most fluent was Spain, because I didn't experience that much prejudices in Spain, and it was just so relationship focused, so it was easier to connect with people. Canada, I came to Canada because they promote themselves as diversity and inclusion. And when I came to Canada, I already had done work around inclusion and diversity. So I worked, for example, with indigenous communities in Guatemala. And so I think I had this kind of thing that Canada is living diversity and inclusion. So when I came here, like being an immigrant here, I had an extreme experience of exclusion. Being non-binary here, I have still a very extreme experience of exclusion. So it was really shocking for me to come here, because just my ideas was more positive. I learned about everything that goes on here with Indigenous communities. So it was really a challenging journey to think about, like, okay, how do I accept what is, but also how do I position me to accept what is? Like, I don't think it's healthy if counseling doesn't practice anti-oppressive practice, but we don't have an obligation to do it. So there were many things where I collided with the culture here. Some of it is maybe because I already was doing it before. And some of it is what I've noticed in the beginning, people weren't able to explain to me how their culture is. And their also culture is such, like, every person has a different culture. So queer folks were more able to explain to me what is queer culture. But like when I felt confused with, let's say, cis, white, straight Canadians, like I know something is off, but if they can't explain to me what's going on for them, we can't connect.
Right.
So overall, Canada for me was most challenging, but I also was in a very different state in my life.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting because you have the immigrant. Yeah, you have a lot intersectionality. I mentioned earlier. You have a lot of different pieces to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So talk a little about. You said you work with the Indigenous people.
Like I did, like when I studied here, I did a program that was with Indigenous focus. So yes, I do have Indigenous clients. For me, it's a lot around like how to take care of my settler privilege. I know that being here, like I face the question, like I know being here to some degree is unethical. like I came here as an immigrant, like I have a choice to leave. And I know for Indigenous people, there is something about it. So I thought like my decision to stay was just because I hope that I can role model more on how can we take care of our settler privilege. And like, if I work with Indigenous clients, it's really like we sort out like, what is my role and what is their role, and we are different. And yes, I'm in the role of the colonizer towards them. So how do we navigate it, and how can we create a healthy relationship that is working for them? So there's a lot going on in the relationship where we are really honest with each other, and also where we see it as an opportunity to grow. But I think when we speak about reconciliation, like it's not an easy process, but it requires this deep inner work. Because right now, Indigenous people, they do all the work and all the education, but there's a lot, like, I don't know how many, but like there is resistance for settlers to take responsibility of what's theirs.
Right. Yeah. How do you sleep?
What do you mean?
It's like I feel like, just my brain is going a mile or a million miles a minute right now. Seems like you have a lot of stuff that you could have in your brain. I'm just wondering how you get your brain to shut off at night to go to sleep with all the things you're working on and thinking about.
Oh, I do a lot of meditation. I do a lot of yoga. I have a very good self-care system, and I also know when to let go. Like I did advocacy work with certain organization, and after a year, I needed to say them I leave because you're not willing to change. So I learned a lot around my boundaries.
There you go.
I have a couple of people who do the same work I'm doing, and I really exchange with them because sometimes it's a bit crazy making.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's great. Self-care is really important, and having other people you can talk to the stuff about makes a big difference too.
Yeah.
What is one tip you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? Just something simple that doesn't take a lot of time or money, just something they can start today to be more inclusive.
Go to the library and get a book about somebody who has a lived experience you don't know.
Right. Do you have any recommendations on like a good book for me to read of somebody you know that would help me learn more about these type of things?
I have a book, like it's more generic. It's not lived experience, but it's a book that really inspired me. It's called Being an Ally, How to Break the Cycle of Oppression. And it's written by Anne Bishop. And she explains more about privilege, and she also gives really steps on how you can learn to navigate it. Like, I think it's an easy starter if people are interested in doing this work.
Awesome. Why don't you share how can people connect with you?
Oh, like people can find me on my website. It is brighthorizontherapies.com. People can also check out my podcast, Trauma Demystified. And if they're interested to check out, they can also send me an email to nat@brighthorizontherapies.com.
Awesome. Are you ready for my last question?
Sure.
Do you like Spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
I don't know it.
You don't know it? Okay. Well, it's like a ground up meat product in a can.
Okay, I'm vegetarian.
Okay. So it'd be a no.
Yes.
So I live in Austin, Minnesota, where Hormel, the company Hormel is, which does like meat products. So I've asked all my guests if they like it or not, just as kind of a funny thing. So no, that's fair. That's fair. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. I had a good time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.